a late model Peugeot, with my friend Larry, and we were crossing the West African country of Senegal from east to west. But our taxi's engine had overheated, and we were limping slowly into a rural village. As soon as we stopped, all 5 of the Africans who were in the car with us jumped out and disappeared. So my friend Larry and I, we got out, we stretched our legs, we wondered aloud whether the car we were in was going to make it to Mali, because it had already broken down once in the desert. Now it's breaking down a second time. While we were talking, there was some noise and commotion. I looked over, and there were about 20 guys pointing at us and saying the same word over and over again. They were 20 guys, but they looked like about 50 guys, and they were moving toward us saying this word. I said to Larry, "Come on, let's go meet them." And he said, "No, I'm staying with the car." On his many travels, he apparently learned that diversions precede thefts. So he stubbornly, probably wisely, but stubbornly insisted on staying with the car. So I moved towards this group of guys coming towards me. And when we met, a spokesman emerged out of the group, and I engaged him with greetings that I had learned in Arabic and Wolof. So I said, "Salam alaikum," which means hello, or literally, God, peace be upon you. And he said, "Malikum salam," which was hello right back at you. And then I said something like, "Nangadef," and he said, "Amang navirek," which is, "How are you?" And "I'm okay." So far everything's going well. And it was my turn to say something else, because Wolof greetings go on and on and on and on and on. But my mind went blank. I could not think of the next thing to say. So I just stood there. And so he said something to me, which I didn't understand, and I shrugged my shoulders. He said something else to me, and I responded in English, "I don't understand." And then the men looked at each other, and I wondered what was going to happen next. And then they just started laughing at me, and they turned around and walked away. I later asked an English speaker living in Mali, what was that word they were saying? And he said, it's the equivalent of gringo. They were saying, white guy, white guy, white guy. It is difficult to make yourself understood when you are in another country with people who speak a different language. And it's not just a matter of words. We sometimes think if I get the language down, that'll remove all those communication barriers. It's not that way. It's also a matter of culture and beliefs and attitudes that makes plenty of opportunity for misunderstanding. So with that in mind, I want you to think about the lengths which God must go to communicate in a way that humans understand. He's not just communicating cross-culturally, but across the unfathomable creator-creature divide. It's not like my attempt to speak Wolof to other men. It's more like a man trying to communicate his intentions to a wild bird or to a fish, except the gap between human and fish is much narrower than the gap between God and human. And God's doing more than communicating to humans. He's rescuing them. He's bringing them into a life that exceeds their greatest ambitions. He doesn't just want to communicate. He wants to save us, change us, and rehumanize us, because we have been dehumanized by sin. Now, imagine if you tried to bring an injured sparrow to the place where it trusted you enough to obey you and follow your lead, even when it frightened it and caused it pain. Perhaps you would need to become a bird in order for that sparrow to trust you. Perhaps the Creator would need to become a human in order for humans to trust him. And that, according to the biblical writers, is precisely what the Creator did. So today we're going to begin what I expect will be a 12-Sunday series in which Jesus introduces himself to us. We're going to spend our time in the Gospel of John focusing on 8 occasions in which Jesus said, I am. We're going to see why those words are important. Why I am, and then he introduced something important about himself. So we'll look at the first of those 8 statements next week. This week, we're going to set the frame for those statements. Because without the right frame, we'll try to fit what Jesus is saying into the wrong frame, one that maybe even Jesus wouldn't recognize. And yet we'll think that we're being biblical because we're using Jesus' words. So getting the frame right is important. St. John constructed his frame from Old Testament ideas and pictures. Now that makes sense when we realize that 1 out of every 10 verses that records Jesus speaking records him either quoting or alluding to the Old Testament. 1 out of 10. In the New Testament as a whole, there are about 300 direct quotations from the Old Testament and another 1,200 or so allusions to the Old Testament. In John chapter 1, the first 18 verses, known as the prologue, in that passage, John weaves Old Testament words and images through everything he says, starting with the first sentence. If you were able to pull out the Old Testament threads from John's gospel, the entire thing would just fall apart. The first phrase in John's gospel is one of those threads. It's identical to the opening words of the Bible, in the beginning. See, John wants his readers to know that the story he's about to tell them about Jesus is part of that story, the in the beginning story. If you separate Jesus from the Old Testament, you will not understand Jesus. If you separate the Old Testament from Jesus, you will not understand the Old Testament. And if you separate yourself from the Old Testament / Jesus story, you're not going to understand yourself. Because that is the story we occupy. You cannot understand yourself until you know what story you're in. We are in the story that John is telling, the Jesus story, the Genesis chapter 1 story. And we need to think of ourselves as part of that story. That is critical to spiritual formation and Christ-likeness. If you think you're in the wrong story, that's not going to work right. People cannot be storyless. Everyone has a story that they fit into. Sometimes they imagine the wrong story. It might be the popular one about the idea that we were put on earth only so that we could escape it and go to heaven. That is not the Genesis story. That's not the Jesus story. And it's not our story. That's Plato's story. That is the story of Plato. If you think you're a character in Plato's story, you're going to find it hard to live the Christian life. And you won't know why. After repeating the opening phrase of the Bible, in the beginning, John tells us that the Word is a title that John gives to Jesus. The Word was already there and instrumental in the creation of the universe. Now, Old Testament readers knew that God created the world, the heavens and the earth, by his Word. In Genesis 1, we read it again and again. And God said, and it was so. And God said, let there be light, let the land masses separate, and on and on and on. And it was so. The psalmist summarized it this way: by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. By John's time, the rabbis had noticed how John spoke 10 times. They would say, God gave 10 words in Genesis chapter 1. The 10 words. Did you know that in Hebrew, the phrase the 10 commandments is just the 10 words? The rabbis equated the 10 words that God spoke to create the universe with the 10 words he gave at Sinai, the law. And so they thought that God created the universe through his law, through his Torah. John knows this as he's writing, and he equates Jesus with the word that created the universe and the word that authoritatively governs the universe. So John begins his story about Jesus with the first words of Genesis. That's in the beginning. In verse 3, when God said, "Let there be light" in Genesis, and there was light, and by the word light repeats 5 times in just 3 verses. I think God just said, "Let there be rain," and there is rain. 5 times the word light appears in Genesis 3 through 5. God said, "Let there be light," and then it repeats 4 more times. John echoes that in John chapter 1, very intentionally using the word light in verses 4, 5, 7, 8, and 9. In Genesis 1, this is brilliant. In Genesis 1, we read that darkness was over the surface of the deep. John follows that pattern by speaking of darkness. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it, or has not grasped it, literally. Why is John doing this? Because he wants us to understand that the story he's telling about Jesus and the disciples is part of the Genesis 1 story. It's all the same story. Now, you can hear that and think that these similarities are just coincidental. Those kinds of things happen until you see where John is taking us. Genesis tells us about creation. John tells us about recreation. Now, what is created in Genesis? This is important, but people miss it all the time. And they get into arguments about, was this created in 6 days, or was each day an age, and all that kind of stuff. And they miss what the author of Genesis is doing. He, by the way, is not interested in how creation happened. He's interested in who made it happen. Yahweh, the Lord, God. But in Genesis, what's happening? Himself a temple. And John is going to go on in his gospel and tell us about the new temple, the new place where God and humans meet. Do you remember how many days are mentioned in Genesis chapter 1? How many days? 7, right? 7 days, that is not arbitrary. Do you know how many days it took to dedicate a temple? 7. God created the cosmos to be a temple. This earth, this world, a temple where he and his people could dwell together. Do you know what happened on the 6th day of the temple dedication? The image of God was set in the temple's holiest place. Do you know what happened on the 6th day of creation? God made his own image and set him in the cosmic temple's holy place in Eden. So Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our image. Verse 27 is, so in the likeness, in the image of God, in his own image he made him, in his own likeness. And then Genesis chapter 2, the Lord took the man, his image, and put him in the Garden of Eden. He was setting his image in the holy place. Now, things went horribly wrong because the living, choosing, image-bearing humans defied God, they defiled his temple, and they were driven out of Eden, the holy place of God's cosmic temple. First century people understood that's the story that they were living in. They knew that things had gone wrong, but that God had not given up. He chose Abraham, their forefather, and his descendants, the Jews, and gave them a second sacred place, the promised land. That it was a sacred place is very clear. Numbers 35-34, just one instance, God says to Israel, do not defile the land where you live and where I dwell. That's temple talk. For I, the Lord, dwell there among the Israelites. Don't defile my sacred place like Adam did. God gave Adam a command in the garden. God gave the Jewish people commands at Sinai. Adam flouted God's command in the garden and was exiled. Israel flouted God's commands and were exiled from the sacred land. See, it's all part of the same story that is being recapitulated. Before the exile, the pride of the Jewish people was the temple. So in Jeremiah, they cry out, the temple, the temple. They don't believe that God will ever allow anything to happen to the temple. At first, that temple was a portable one. We call it the tabernacle. Later, that was replaced by a stationary stone and wood temple in Jerusalem. But unlike every other ancient Near East temple, there was no image of God set in the holy place. If you read about the Holy of Holies, there is no image of God like in all the other temples. And God even prohibited the Jews from making one. And there was a reason for that. God had already made one. He had made humans. He had made them as his image. But that image had been defaced. And now a major restoration project was needed before the image could be returned to its place and the temple project completed. That's the story we are in. God is conforming Jesus' people to the image of his Son. So we know that all things work together for good for them that love God, for them that are called according to his purpose. For, the next word, those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. He's restoring the image so that we can be restored to our rightful place and the temple project can be completed. So keep in mind that Genesis 1 is the beginning of this story. You know, if you follow the story through to Exodus 40, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, go read all the way through Exodus 40, you'll see that Adam's sin did not cause God to give up on the temple plan. He still intended to dwell with his people. When people read Exodus, you know what they do? They come to chapter 14 and they say, there's the climax of Exodus. That's when God parts the Red Sea and Israel goes through and the Egyptians are terribly defeated. Or if it's not there, it's in chapter 20. That must be the climax, when God gives the law to Israel's people. And then after chapter 20, things get really slow. You're reading about that tabernacle and all the stuff that people bring, and it goes on chapter after chapter. And we think the climax has already happened. No, an ancient reader would know that the climax comes in chapter 40, when the tabernacle has been completed and the presence of the Creator God fills the tabernacle. And God dwells with his people, as he had in Eden. That was always God's plan. Unfortunately, God's people reenacted Adam's rebellion, and they got themselves banished from the promised land. The temple was destroyed, and God's presence departed. That's Ezekiel. That was the story that John's readers were living in. That's the story his readers are still living in. During John's time, the rabbi said that God gave his law, the 10 words, to all the peoples of the world, but only the Jews recognized it. I guess that made them feel like we're special. We recognize God's law. Nobody else did. John plays off that idea in verse 10 when he says that the word came to his own people, the Jews, and even they did not recognize him. God created the cosmos to be a temple. People defiled it. So God chose a man and his descendants, the Jews, rescued them from slavery in Egypt. So you remember why God was rescuing them? So that they could worship him. More temple talk. Then God gave them a portable temple, the tabernacle, where his presence could dwell with them. That's the story of Genesis and Exodus, which ends with the descent of God, the Creator, into the tabernacle to dwell with his people. So Exodus chapter 40, verse 34, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Now, later Solomon would build a stationary temple. God said there would be a place where his name would dwell. He was talking about Jerusalem. Solomon built the temple, dedicated it, by the way, in 7 days. And then the Jews went on to celebrate it for another 7 days. And once again, the glory of the Lord descended on the temple, and the Creator dwelled with humans, which is the whole point of the story. But that temple was also defiled. People worshiped idols, and when God told them to stop it, they wouldn't. And they were forced again out of the sacred land, just as Adam was forced out of Eden. God's presence departed. Ezekiel sees that in a vision. A second temple was eventually constructed. That second temple was added on to during Jesus' time. It was called Herod's temple. But this is important. Into Herod's temple, the presence of God did not descend. It was not like the tabernacle. It was not like the first temple. But the prophets promised that God would come back. John is picking up that story and telling his readers how God came back in the person of his Son. So this is verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. When the Word that was God, verse 1, became flesh, God did what he always intended to do, make his dwelling with people. And what did those people see? They saw glory, the same glory that filled the tabernacle, the same glory that came down on Solomon's temple, the glory that Ezekiel saw departing, but both he and Isaiah promised would return. Now, you may think that's all a stretch, but listen to this. The Word became flesh, and guess what the next word in the original language is? The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. John's choice of that very unusual word, he tabernacled, the only other place it's used, very importantly, is in Revelation. He's talking about tabernacle glory. The glory that departed, just as the prophets had promised, has returned in Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. The tabernacle was where God dwelled with his people in the wilderness. The temple is where God dwelled with his people in Jerusalem. Jesus is where God dwells with people now. This is the continuation of the story. It's the story the first martyr, Stephen, told. And after telling this long story, he looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Or, this would be perfectly admissible translation. He looked up and saw the glory of God, even Jesus, standing at God's right hand. This is the story Paul knew. God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, he's talking about Genesis 1:3, made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of what? The glory of God, where? In the face of Christ. See, this is the story that we read about in the final book of the Bible, in the Revelation. In those last great chapters, chapters 21 and 22, we see this clearly. John writes, now the dwelling, guess what the word is? Now the tabernacle of God is with men. And he will live, guess what the word is? Tabernacle with them. You folks who like camping and tent camping, this should be your dream. You're going to tabernacle with God. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. That has always been the plan. In Revelation, we read that the new Jerusalem will come down to earth, and God will dwell there with his people as always intended. But then John, for some reason, says, I did not see a temple in the city. Well, how can that be? The temple is the place where God dwells with his people. John's answer, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb, another title for Jesus, are its temple. And when that happens, we will be the image of God that is finally set in its rightful place. That's the story that we're in. As we begin this series introducing Jesus in his own words, we need to get the story right. This is the story of the God who made a cosmos-sized temple, placed his image in the holy place where we would live and he would live with his people. This is the story of how things went wrong, how God is setting it right. And it's the story that you are living in right now. The story of how God, through Christ, is restoring his image and dwelling with his people. And it is a great story. And the hero of this story is our Lord Jesus Christ.